Today I promised to talk more about Nagarjuna, in particular Nagarjuna's chapter from the verses of the Middle Way, chapter 25, where he talks about nirvana. Not such an easy topic, but I'm going to make a stab at it, and I'm going to try and talk about nirvana from a couple of different angles, to try and make these ideas as accessible as possible to us. This is my third talk on Nagarjuna. I doubt if all of you have been at the previous two, but Nagarjuna is a very important figure in Mahayana Buddhism, which is the school of Buddhism we follow here at Mava. Legend has it that the sutras, which make up the Mahayana teachings, became known through Nagarjuna. And there's a legend that these sutras had been entrusted by the Buddha to these serpent-like deities called the Nagas, and that they transmitted them to Nagarjuna, and hence his name, Nagarjuna. So his name actually links him to that legend. He also made commentaries and wrote other teachings of his own on the themes, the kernels of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. One of his key writings was verses of the Middle Way. The Sanskrit name is Mula Madhyamika Karika, and the main theme of those writings is that as trying to help us understand emptiness. And he approaches it as some very very precise, very sort of intellectual, philosophical, dialectical arguments, which I don't particularly have a very good head for. But then he's also very comfortable with dealing with contradictions. And I just learned that that's actually coming into contemporary philosophy too. It's okay. The world can handle contradictions, and our conception of reality must be able to accommodate apparently logical contradictions. Anyway, I won't go any more into that, but just to give you a sense of what these writings and teachings are like. In chapter 25 on Nirvana, Nagarjuna makes a rather startling assertion, and I think this is tossed around quite a lot among students of Buddhism, that samsara and nirvana are actually indistinguishable. So how are we to understand that? For those of you who might not be familiar with either of those terms, samsara is the state in which we find ourselves now. It's a state in which we experience suffering. We experience this as we make the same mistakes over and over again. We find ourselves clinging to our habits and our preferences. Nirvana is the name for our release from that state. So one sense of the word nirvana is unbinding, being released from bondage. But Nagarjuna teaches us that this idea of binding or bondage, that these are terms that belong to the realm of relative truth. Just to back up a little bit, there are two truths in this scheme, this philosophy. There's the relative or conventional truth, and there's absolute or ultimate truth. So in the sense of bondage or binding, we can't say that bondage exists inherently. It's not a state that exists by itself. Why? It doesn't make sense unless you're talking about someone who is in bondage. So neither does a person in bondage exist inherently. It's not a state that exists by itself. And it's a good thing because it means they're interdependent, and therefore they can be ended. There's a way out of that. They can change. So bondage and binding, one in bondage, have no inherent existence. So Nagarjuna felt that the term nirvana was useful for indicating release, but only if the term did not refer to something that could be an object for clinging. Because once we name something, once we separate it out by itself as an object with inherent existence, we can then grasp after it. We call this nirvana a state or a place, and we can crave after it as essentially different from where we are now. We see it as highly desirable because it means liberation from our suffering. But it's self-defeating to grasp onto this end of grasping, because by definition, nirvana cannot be attained in that way. According to Nagarjuna, nirvana requires a complete cessation of grasping, including that onto nirvana itself. If you see nirvana as inherently existing, it becomes an illusion that will only perpetuate more grasping and more suffering. So we can't really distinguish nirvana from samsara because they have to be inherently existing things. But they're empty. This is what we mean by emptiness. Contingent on other things, interdependent. One concept cannot exist except in relation to the other. So, samsara and nirvana are only different in the relative sense. In the ultimate sense, there's no difference because of their emptiness. I know this might sound confusing or even like nonsense, but it actually has a very practical application, and that is to shatter dualities and weaken our avenues, destroy our avenues for grasping. It's intended to really shake our minds out of their habitual ways of seeing things. If we can get past our usual dualistic thinking and where we see only the distinctions between things, instead of their correspondences, their interdependence, their contingent natures, then we can see the wholeness of life, and then we can achieve our own wholeness. The trouble is, it's very hard to talk about anything without making distinctions. It's impossible. Once you name something, once you come up with a word for something, you set it out as a thing, and you've made a distinction. So it's not something that we can't talk our way into enlightenment. We can also look at the emptiness of nirvana and samsara in this way. Without suffering, we can never know release from suffering. And when we see freedom as something separate from our suffering, then we're grasping onto an object and inviting more suffering. Think about our karma, we're related to our karma. We think of it as our karma. Our pre-existing propensities to act in certain ways. So in the same way, we're related to our suffering. And our freedom is also related to our suffering. I think we need to understand samsara and nirvana, that samsara is nirvana in this sense, and that suffering is a tool that allows us to reach our goal of freedom. I said earlier that one sense of the word nirvana is unbinding. There's another sense, which is extinguishing or extinction. The Pali word for nirvana is nibbana. And if we look at that term, the roots of that are va, meaning to blow, and vana, which means either weaving or craving after life. And ni is a particle implying negation. So there's a sense of blowing out life, or blowing out the craving for life. But we shouldn't think of nirvana as a kind of death wish. Also, although the Dharma helps us lose our fear of death, we don't lose our compassion for all living beings and the understanding of the importance and the preciousness of life. We need to remember that it's equally unwholesome. As unwholesome as it is to crave after life, it's equally unwholesome to crave after non-existence, or existence and non-existence. Life is precious because it's necessary, especially human life, for attaining enlightenment. But in the Jataka tales, we see that animal life, too, is a gateway and a precursor of Buddhahood. The Jataka tales are the stories of the Buddha's past lives. This sense of nirvana is important, and I wanted to bring it up because it relates to the extinction of species that we're seeing in these days of climate change. Scientists call this period the sixth great extinction since the world began. Buddhism teaches the acceptance of things as they are. But does this mean we should be satisfied with this state of affairs, with this state of mass extinction of species? I don't think so. We're also taught to feel compassion for the numberless beings and their inevitable suffering as they undergo this extinction, and the ripple effects that one species' extinction will have on other species. Acceptance of things as they are does not excuse us from responsibility for this situation. 17 animal species vanish every hour. How can we be unmoved by this realization? I'm sure you've all heard about the crisis with honeybees, and they're in grave danger, and along with them our food supply. We won't be unaffected by these facts because one extinction has its ties to our own extinction. But what can we do about it? The first step, maybe not the first step, we're probably already taking steps as best we can to use less energy, to turn off our lights, drive less, reduce, reuse, recycle. We all know these methods. But we also need to cultivate mindfulness and the awareness that we humans are an inseparable component of the natural world. I think only in this way will our behavior have a chance of changing enough to really make a difference. Our practice allows us to see the preciousness and immediacy of life so that we will directly experience our oneness with nature. So that we'll directly experience the fact that separateness is a myth and a delusion. If we go back to the two truths, we can see that these two are empty because they're interdependent. If we think of the absolute truth as spiritual and the relative truth as material, we see that these terms too are contingent on one another and therefore empty. In other words, it's false to try and separate the spiritual from the material. If we wish to put it in terms of God and creation, can we not draw the same conclusion, that one is not separate from the other? So, to return to the topic of nirvana, Nagarjuna's teachings on emptiness show us that nirvana is not a thing to be grasped after, but is actually indistinguishable from our practice, from the opportunities that our sufferings and our karmic seeds constantly provide us to break the cycle of clinging, which causes suffering. So in the next part of my talk, I'd like to turn to a teaching that I'm sure some of you, maybe many of you, are already familiar with. It's It's a Zen teaching in pictures and verses called the 10 Oxford Pictures. I'm sure some of you have. I'm sorry I don't have, can't project the pictures so that you can experience them that way. I'll just have to describe them, but they're readily available on the internet. So they're these lovely, I assume Japanese, maybe Chinese, paintings, brush paintings, and poems. And they show the path of practice and how it leads to enlightenment in the learner. And they show it in a very beautiful and accessible way that I think encourages us to keep going. The version that I'm drawing on is a translation and commentary by Martine Bachelor. And she cautions us against thinking that the self-development and Zen practice goes in a straight line, that we should think of these stages, these 10 stages, as a cycle where we might return again and again to different stages with greater wisdom and understanding. So the first stage is called searching for the ox. There's two characters in this story. There's the ox herder and the ox, and I think you'll come to see what the ox symbolizes for the ox herder. So searching for the ox is the first stage. And the verse goes, high mountains, deep waters, and a dense jungle of grass. However much you try, the way to proceed remains unclear. To alleviate the sense of frustration, listen to the chirping of cicadas. So in this picture, the young ox herder is looking around, looking a little lost. He's searching for something, but he's not even sure what. So this is the stage where we haven't even really set off on the spiritual path, but we feel somewhat uncomfortable and unsatisfied with our life as it is. We could say there are faint stirrings within us. First, we experiment with material things. We think that the answer lies there. We buy things, car, house, clothes, gadgets, but we realize that the happiness is not it's very short-lived. We might turn to the perfect relationship and think that that's where ultimate happiness lies, perhaps a highly paid job. None of these things really provide the answer for us. So we, or the ox herder, is actually anxiously looking for something, inner peace, contentment, clarity. The second stage is called seeing the footprints. The verse says, a tangle of thorny bushes, a faint murmur of running water. But here and there are footprints. Is this the right path? If you want to pierce its nose and tie it up, do not rely on someone else's strength. So in this picture, the ox herder spies some footprints on the path. This represents a stage where we decide to do something about our dissatisfaction. We start reading around, thinking about things, maybe talking to other people about their spiritual practice. It's a stage of maybe sampling and experimentation, but very little changes at this stage. We're just sort of whetting our taste. The footprints also symbolize the question of relevance. Are these old or new footprints? Are these Zen teachings and meditation relevant to us, or are they only for ancient masters in China or Japan? The third stage is called seeing the ox. And the verse reads, among willow branches swaying in the spring breeze, an oriole is singing. How can the sparrow experience his joy in calling to his mate? Isn't the moonlight glimmering in the forest my home? So the ox herder sees the ox half hidden in the trees at this stage. This represents the stage where we really decide to do something. Perhaps we try meditation in earnest for the first time. And we see that it has some benefits for us. We begin to see the point of this practice and become more familiar with the ideas. We apply ourselves to some serious study. We think maybe we found something and perhaps experience a bit of excitement about it. The fourth stage is called catching the ox. Advancing with difficulty, the ox's nose is pierced, but this fiery nature is hard to control. Dragged here and there, you stray through cloud-covered forests. So the ox herder has finally caught the ox with a rope, but the ox doesn't really want to be caught. He jumps around, dragging the ox herder behind him. Catching the ox was not that hard, but holding on to it requires a lot of strength and energy. And similarly, sitting down with the method that we've learned is the easy part, but applying the instruction and dedicating ourselves to practice for certain lengths of time, periods of time, requires a lot of determination and strength. We also find that there are a lot of obstacles to our practice: restlessness, sleepiness, daydreaming, and so forth. So we start to realize it's going to take some time before we overcome the power of our karmic tendencies that we've been practicing all our lives up to this point. The fifth stage is called tending the ox. Fearing that it may fall into a steep and perilous path, you hold it tight with whip and bridle, and with the strength of both legs, firmly hold your ground. Once past this critical moment, the ox comes following you. So in this picture, the ox herder is gently leading the ox with a loose rope. The ox has lost his wildness. After having held on tight and sustained our practice, it becomes easier. We find that we're more comfortable with our sitting position. We're not fighting with our body and mind anymore. We find we can concentrate for a certain period of time and have gained some quietness and clarity. But we know we need to remain vigilant. To practice, we have to have some confidence, but not become arrogant. So this picture represents a stage of maturation and ripening of our practice. It's still accompanied by care, carefulness, and vigilance. The sixth stage is riding the ox back home. Sitting astride the ox, the noble person happily returns. The sounds of his flute mingle with the crimson sky. He has discovered the garden of joy. Who else could know about this endlessly pleasurable taste? So in this picture, the rope is gone. The ox herder is mounted on the ox, riding it and playing a flute. The ox knows where to go without being told. So we've advanced on our practice, and we find now that it's about joy and creativity. We become friends with our body and mind. Our fears and insecurities dissolve. 7 is forgetting the ox herder rests alone. Bright moon and cool wind, what a splendid home. Sitting all alone, the ox has gone away. Even if you doze until sunrise, what use would be a whip and bridle? In this picture, the ox has disappeared, and the ox herder is resting alone at home. Up until now, there was this idea that there was something to do, that there was a separation between ourselves and the practice. But at this stage, we become united with our practice. Awareness becomes as natural as breathing. We don't have to do it, it does itself, including our practicing the precepts. Harmlessness and generosity come naturally. 8, the ox and the ox herder are both forgotten. Since space has collapsed, how can obstacles remain? Could a snowflake survive inside a burning flame? You cheerfully come and go. How could you not always laugh? This picture is very abstract. It's that lovely circle, that Zen circle called the Enso, which is a symbol of emptiness. At this stage, we realize that nothing truly belongs to us, that we don't have a solid, separate identity, that we are just a flow of conditions. And this is true of everything, everything ever-changing. And we know that only because of emptiness can things change and flow. Emptiness, we know, is not a vacuum, not a black hole, but it's the possibility of endless transformation. There's no more grasping, and our Buddha nature can shine through and express itself fully. And this is just stage 8. There are 2 more. 9 is called returning to the original place. The verse is, my very own treasure is recovered. All those efforts spent in vain. It would have been better to be blind, deaf, and dumb. The mountains and water are just as they are. So is the bird among the flowers. This is the stage at which it seems to me we really stop species extinction. We stop our degradation of the natural world. We see that the practice doesn't stop at emptiness, because if we attach ourselves to emptiness even, it could lead to separation and isolation. At this stage, we re-enter the world. We realize the interdependence at the root of all life. We see that our life is ordinary and just as it is, but we look at it differently. We become fully open to the world. We're not frightened, but on the contrary, we're exhilarated. The world is us, and we are the world. The final stage is called entering the marketplace with helping hands. And I think this must be the realization of the Bodhisattva ideal. In this picture, there's a ragged, stout man walking barefoot, carrying a stick with a bag attached to it. And this stage represents freedom, wisdom, and compassion. We adapt freely to high and low places and find spirituality everywhere. We're deeply connected to the world. We feel its suffering, and we want to respond and help. When we give, we don't expect anything in return. When we love, it's with total acceptance. And yet we don't force our ideas or our opinions on other people. We have a lightness, and we don't take everything so seriously. So that's the last of the box rating pictures. I hope those were helpful. I just felt that talking about nirvana on that philosophical level might be a bit, probably beyond my capabilities, but maybe also beyond something that would be useful to all of us and something to work with. So I hope that all of us and all beings will see themselves as interdependent, will feel their relation to each other and to all beings, and that in this way we will liberate all beings from suffering and protect the earth and all the life on it for future generations. Thank you for your practice and patience.